again for the introduction, and hi, it is really nice to be a part of this virtual community, and hopefully we can all meet in person in real life sometime. But today I'll be speaking about my research with Dr. Hilary Faxon, a postdoc at UC Berkeley. She can't join today due to the time difference, so I'll try and do justice to this work. She's really critical to it because she is the expert on Myanmar, having done a lot of field work there. So with this project, what we tried to do is integrate my background in using geopolitical or geospatial data within a kind of critical political geography framework with her really rich ethnographic work from 3 years of research in the country. So today I'll just walk through Myanmar's political geography. I'll talk about the methodology we've employed, which involves critical remote sensing. So I'll describe that framework, which is really trying to bring together rigorous remote sensing skills within this more critical framework and applying that kind of theory to pay attention to issues of uneven development and issues of injustice particularly. Then we'll just demonstrate how NightLights can be used as a proxy to estimate development and how we've done that in Myanmar at different scales, looking at different regions within the country, and then crucially, looking at Myanmar's borderlands, specifically through hotspots of development. So with this work, we use both the DMSP OLS dataset to go back to the early 90s, and then the VIIRS data to have a more contemporary look in the past 5-10 years or so. So Myanmar today, just to give you an overview of the country, it's in Southeast Asia. It has a really quite sizable population, 54 million people. And the country, as you may be familiar, for better or worse, is highly ethnically divided. The country's ethnic majority of the Baman people are concentrated in the central region. So Myanmar is divided into states and regions. And then the more, the various ethnic minorities tend to be concentrated in the peripheral states that border Myanmar's 5 neighbors of China, Thailand, Laos, India, and Bangladesh. The one ethnic minority which has the highest profile may be the Rohingya, who have been persecuted by the government and the military for quite a few decades, but very much more so in the past few years. So the Rohingya people have fled to Bangladesh just across the border. So we look at these ethnic divisions and how those affect development and what can be seen from space with regard to these different groups' welfare. Myanmar is also a very resource-rich country, which makes it very lucrative for all of its neighbors to try and get involved and try and get a piece of that pie. It has timber, metals, and rare earths. In fact, it's the world's largest tin producer, which only happened in the past decade or so, which is a really quite impressive phenomenon in a way. Also exports natural gas and opium and other drugs. So there's a lot of illicit trade going on, which also makes the country particularly interesting for NightLights and satellite observations in general, because there's so much that's not being reported in official statistics, and that may even be hard to find out on the ground. So satellites can provide a sort of other lens into those phenomena. And then, of course, Myanmar has been in the news in recent weeks, right? It's very politically unstable. The military has carried out a coup. So there's protests and internet blackouts going on right now. So all the more reason to try and triangulate what's happening with as many sources of data from above and on the ground as possible. So what can critical remote sensing offer that would go beyond what a maybe more typical remote sensing approach would do? With critical remote sensing, as political geographers, both of us are deliberately trying to apply the same skills and tool sets that a remote sensing scientist might do, but within a framework that's much more attentive to the politics of satellites and the data they produce, understanding that these images can be used to highlight certain phenomena and downplay others. I think that kind of process and instrumentalization, if you will, of satellite data was very much clear in the war in Iraq, for instance. So underscoring, first of all, the politics of satellites and the imagery. Second, we actively use the data to push back against some of the narratives that governments might put forward. For instance, the Myanmar government is often celebrating the increase in connectivity and trade with its neighbors. But we want to scrutinize that and even see if it's possible to contest the economic statistics that the Myanmar government may be publishing to that effect. So we are very attentive to processes of uneven development, and particularly which groups of people may be getting left out of these larger statistics of GDP growth and cross-border trade. And then with critical remote sensing, we also try and iterate and go back and forth between this view from above that satellites can importantly provide by enriching and contextualizing that data and those pixels with on-the-ground fieldwork, as Hilary's been doing, and also by kind of situating this data within a more kind of a more attuned, I guess, perspective on what's actually happening with a real kind of local knowledge of Myanmar in this case. And some of these ideas I've explored before in an article in Political Geography, if you're interested. So I think a lot of this, the fact that nightlight imagery can be a really reliable proxy for socioeconomic activity, meaning we can estimate all sorts of processes and anthropogenic processes ranging from population to GDP, even infrastructure, although this gets a little bit tricky. I think a lot of these ideas will be familiar given the other presenters here. But I would just emphasize here that one thing nightlight imagery has a lot of potential for is making estimates in places where there are potentially very inaccurate government statistics or where they are altogether lacking. So Myanmar is one place where this would be quite promising. Some limitations, which I'll return to at the end, are that activities that are not very well lit obviously won't appear in this type of imagery. And that's something that ends up resulting often in the kind of lack of, I guess, the inability of this type of imagery to kind of shed light on what's going on with, for instance, really rural, impoverished people who don't have connections to power grids. We're not really going to be able to understand what's going on with those populations with this data. It just won't be able to tell us that. So that's something I'll return to, which is particularly, I think, important for thinking about these ethnic minorities on Myanmar's periphery. So just drawing on another previous paper I wrote here, just to give you an insight into how we can use nightlight imagery to not only look at phenomena within the boundaries of nation states, which I think tends to be the way that this data does get processed and analyzed, we can importantly look across these borders. And this is an example from Syria with VIIRS imagery, which is very high resolution, a 750 meter resolution here. We can see that just in 2 years during the Syria civil war, all of these lights that surrounded a highway that connected Syria to Iraq completely disappeared. And instead, southern Turkey brightens a lot. So this is where a lot of refugees from Syria were headed. So we can really use this type of data to provide insights into cross-border phenomena, not just looking at processes scaled within a given country. And so that was one driver of our desire to want to examine Myanmar's borders in more detail. So we look at this data across political borders. We use the DMSP-OLS harmonized dataset that was published recently by 2 scholars in Nature. And then we compare that with some of the VIIRS imagery. The harmonized dataset does go into 2018, but we weren't able to use it accurately because I think in very rural areas, the harmonized composites are not that useful in those areas. And then we kind of go back and forth and look at Google Earth imagery to get a higher resolution daytime view into some of these sites. And then we have administrative boundaries to look at the different regions and states and the borders that Myanmar shares. And then, as I mentioned, here's some pictures of Hilary doing fieldwork over the course of 3 years. So moving into the results and discussions. So this is on the right, a change detection map of Myanmar between 1992 and 2013. So the full breadth of the DMSP-OLS data. And what we can see is that Myanmar is a lot darker than almost all of its neighbors except Laos, which is perhaps even more rural and impoverished. So if we were to go in and then assemble that data into the kind of the 16 or so states versus regions, we can see there's a clear disparity in that ethnic majority lowland regions where the Bamon people live are actually 5 times brighter per kilometer squared than the ethnic minority states. And you can see that even within Myanmar, a lot of the lights are concentrated up and down in the middle where the main cities and infrastructural corridors lie. That being said, nighttime lights in ethnic minority states did increase more quickly, which might suggest they're undergoing more rapid development. We also noticed that there's exponential growth in the new capital of Naypyidaw, which was a kind of contrived capital that the government decided to just put smack dab in the middle of Myanmar in 2002. And you can see in Google Earth imagery, it really just transformed overnight, sucking up a lot of the kind of growth from neighboring states. This was quite interesting, and this is where a lot of our attention focused in our analysis. Is basically what we did here was we took a 25-kilometer wide kind of frontier along the interior of Myanmar and then compared it to the 25 wide kilometer frontier on the other side, so spanning through those 5 countries, those 5 neighbors. And if we were to total all of the lights in the interior versus foreign borderlands of Myanmar, we determined that Myanmar's interior borderland is only 11% as bright on average as the frontier across the border. So that suggests, as you can see here in this Veer's tritemporal composite, where red lights are more recent bright lights and blue ones were brighter a little bit earlier on in the period, what you can see is that really there's development happening in Myanmar's 5 neighbors, and 4 of its 5 neighbors, running up all the way to the border. But that is not really being mirrored in Myanmar. So that suggests that even though trade may be increasing between Myanmar and its neighbors, it's not taking the form of infrastructure development that's visible from space. And instead, it might point to a real extraction of resources in Myanmar without any added value coming in. And this may be occurring as a result of a kind of encroachment and extractive processes being led by its neighbors. And so I'll just walk through a couple of examples. We used the hotspot tool in ArcGIS to kind of drill down into where these, the kind of brightest, statistically significant brightest concentrations of lights lie. And you can really see that these are over a 6-year period, just tend to be concentrated in China and Thailand. So that might be where the most lights are happening, and also maybe the most trade and various forms of extraction, both legal and illicit. And so what was also interesting is that if you were to look even more closely at these hotspots, almost all of them fall on the foreign side of the border, and they're very rarely on the Myanmar side. And so we are able to look at this in 3 places in particular. So we look in China, on the border with China, Thailand, and then Bangladesh. And so with China, this was perhaps one of the few instances where lights in Myanmar, where the hotspots, if you will, were actually on the Myanmar side. And so what these hotspots on the Myanmar side reflect is interesting, because this is a part of Myanmar that's actually controlled by the United Wa State Army, which is the kind of breakaway faction that represents the Wa people, who are more ethnically Chinese, often speak Chinese language. And I think with this phenomenon, where you even see here the kind of town is very bright on the Myanmar side, this is a real kind of hub for all sorts of illegal trade of tin and opium and wildlife products. The one in the middle is interesting because this is a new housing development being led by the United Wa State Army. And I think this might suggest that perhaps these militias and armies, which are, I think, often in the media thought of as these almost evil forces, actually can provide infrastructure development sometimes, maybe arguably in a more effective manner than the government, especially in these peripheral regions. So a process certainly that merits further thinking through. Looking at the case of Thailand, this is one other instance where there's some lights that we noticed are increasing on the Myanmar side, but you can see in the top right here, they're almost still all concentrated in Thailand. There has been more and more infrastructure development here, but it still seems very unequal, and it seems like maybe a lot of that activity is ending up draining into Thailand, which maybe is really kind of benefiting from this enhanced connectivity, which is now taking the form of a new Asian highway that will go all the way to India. So Myanmar is getting more and more connected, but it's not necessarily getting brighter. Now, the last vignette here to highlight is the most tragic one, and this involves the single set of hotspots around Bangladesh, the Bangladesh-Myanmar border. And again, as you see in the second picture here, all of those hotspots are concentrated on the Bangladesh side. But what they are pointing to is not any form of, necessarily long-term infrastructure development, but rather the establishment of the world's largest refugee settlement. So some 700,000 Rohingya refugees have fled from Rakhine State into Bangladesh in the past 4 or 5 years or so. And other research published in various remote sensing journals has attested to the fact that there's also been a lot of deforestation going on, which you can see in Google Earth and other daytime satellite imagery. So I just want to move to the end here, since time is coming up, and just return to my point about some of the limitations of NightLight data. I think often with satellite imagery, it's thought that they can see everything, they can perhaps potentially solve everything because they are so omniscient, but there are many things that they cannot see. And so one of these things is often massacres of people who never lived in illuminated houses to begin with. And this work has been done, this kind of satellite imagery using Google Earth and other optical daytime imagery has been done by various think tanks and nonprofits, which pointed to a really terrible massacre of people in the village of 𝗖𝗨 in August 2017 as part of this ongoing genocide. And you can see how this village along the river, in the middle figure, is actually entirely burned to the ground, and in fact has now grown back as basically kind of just vegetation. If we were to look at this with the nighttime light imagery, there's basically no difference. So imagine if you had no idea that this was ever an issue, this massacre, it would look as if nothing had happened in the nightlight data. So I think this just points to the fact that we really need to kind of, in doing critical remote sensing, try and triangulate between both on the ground and satellite views to get the full picture of what's going on. So to conclude here, we detect rapid brightening of this kind of black hole during the earlier reform period in Myanmar. But some of the new brightening that we notice in the country is starting to reproduce various spatial and ethnic patterns of uneven development. Some exceptions, though, might be in areas which are not necessarily controlled by the government, but rather by some of these kind of breakaway autonomous governments and armies. Also, Myanmar is still much dimmer than its neighbors, despite the government starting to trumpet this increase in connectivity. So, only 11% as bright on average as the rest of the region is a massive disparity. Lastly here, a critical remote sensing framework that ground truths geospatial data with ethnographic and qualitative observations, I think is important in that it can reveal these trajectories of resource extraction, cross-border trade, and forced migration, and force us to think harder about questions of social and spatial justice. So I'll leave it there, and I think there's a minute or so for questions. Thanks so much for listening.